Hello and welcome to Talking History. In this episode, we'll tell you the story of how the new city, the imperial capital of India, the New Delhi, was built, carved and sculpted out from the bushes of a ridge and a nearby hillock. New Delhi, it still houses the beaming corridors of power. This is the story of the capital.
After the Great Uprising of 1857 was suppressed by the British, the East India Company rule, also referred to as Company rule, ended too. And India came under the direct rule of the British Crown, with Queen Victoria, her empress.
The first attack of the British on the old city of Shahjahanabad left it really mutilated. And you saw the beginning of the end of that last capital of the Mughal Empire. It was very sad because that was a very, very beautiful part of Delhi. It was the capital. The Red Fort still stands very grand, as does Chandni Chowk and the channel that ran through it. And there's some wonderful drawings of that period and so on, but then it was mutilated and civil lines came to be in Old Delhi, and the British then started to rule from there.
So what began with the coming of English traders and merchants for the purpose of commerce was slowly transformed into an occupation of India. The British Raj began in Indian subcontinent in the year 1858. Calcutta, the political nerve center of the British, was conferred the status of the imperial capital. But by the turn of 20th century, the British felt need to have a rather central place for its capital, both geographically and symbolically.
When the Crown decided to shift the capital from Calcutta to Delhi, it was because the partition of Bengal hadn't worked. And, it had got all very complicated and it was politically very hot, the subject. And so King Emperor decided, why not shift the capital to Delhi? And Delhi had been the seat of power of many, many dynasties.
It was then the groundwork for Delhi's coronation as capital began. Given the ancient city's rich history and glorious past for being the seat of power of several kingdoms through the eras. In his letter to the then Secretary of State, Viceroy Lord Hardinge listed elaborate reasons for transferring capital to Delhi. It's intimately associated in the minds of Hindus with sacred legends. The Purana Kila still marks the site of the city which they founded and called Indraprastha. To the Mohammedans, it would be a source of unbounded gratification to see the ancient capital of Mughals restored. The change will strike the imagination of the people of India as nothing else could do. It would be hailed with joy by the ruling chiefs and would be warmly welcomed by the vast majority of Indians throughout the continent. On December the 12th, year 1911, at the Great Delhi Durbar held to coronate the then King George V and Queen Mary, the announcement to shift capital to Delhi was made.
It was here where the Grand Delhi Durbar was held. 106 years ago, the width and margin of the space which is now called Coronation Park was packed with fully dressed officers and Maharajas of erstwhile Indian principalities, in front of whom King George announced the shifting of capital from Calcutta to New Delhi.
In 1911, when the Delhi Durbar happened and the land was levelled, all the princes were invited to Delhi and they all put up very elaborate tents, and a huge tented city was created, and the king and queen came, and at that event the proclamation for the new capital was announced. And many people were taken by surprise about this because it wasn't something that was in the offing. It really was a very well-kept secret. And at that point, some very ingenious Indian entrepreneurs of that time came to Delhi and decided to work with the British to get a contract. And Sobha Singh was one of those, along with some other Sardar families. And I always call those 5 Sardar families the first families of New Delhi, because they came, they left their homes, they crossed the border, they came here to this new building site looking for work and stayed.
The foundation of the imperial capital was then laid, which took 20 years to be built. Interestingly, there was a split in the choice of the location for the new capital. Even before the uprising of 1857, the British had begun to build their residencies to the north of Shahjahanabad, which soon was relegated to the name Old Delhi. Today, the area houses civil lines and Delhi University, among other prominent installations. The second choice was that of ridge and plains on the southern side of Delhi Gate. It was the latter choice which was stamped by the expert committee after the survey by Lord Hardinge.
The site selection was really quite interesting because the sense was to use the ridge, demolish it, cut it down and build a capital on that ridge. Lord Hardinge put his foot down on that one, and he said that when you attack nature or disturb nature or intrude in nature, nature gets its back on you. So they looked at Raisina Hill. There was the village of Malcha, which was just next to the ridge, which is now Malcha Marg and Chanakyapuri, and there was this Raisina Hill. So they decided to go to Raisina Hill. They actually had to blast the top of the hill to create the base to build Rashtrapati Bhavan, because it was a hill. And so that's how it moved on the edge of the ridge rather than on the flat land of the ridge itself.
After the selection of site, other selection was to be made, that of an architect and the town planner. It was here Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker were entrusted with the task to carve the capital.
Edwin Lutyens and Lancaster were 2 architects who were selected for the building of the capital, which was the jewel in the colonial crown. And Edwin Lutyens won the contract, was then requested to partner with Herbert Baker. So they became the partners who built New Delhi. And Lancaster, who lost the contract, was invited by Singh of Jodhpur to come there at a time of drought and build Umaid Bhavan.
The seat of power was also to house the highest authority on the land, the Viceroy. Built on a hillock called Raisina Hill, Rashtrapati Bhavan housed the Viceroys of India till 1948, with Lord Mountbatten its last imperial occupant.
The first difference between Baker and Lutyens was the gradient going up to Rashtrapati Bhavan. I won't elaborate on that because it's complicated, but finally Baker had his way. So when you look at Rashtrapati Bhavan from the base of Vijay Chowk and you look up, you see the dome. You don't see an imposing building standing there, but you see north and south block clearly. As you go up the paths, suddenly Rashtrapati Bhavan rises out of the gradient at the pinnacle of power. But it is suppressed when you see it from Parliament House, from the base. Because India, and it suited India because when we became independent, you had the governing authority at a height, you had the president, the titular head, You only saw him as the building in which he was lodged as you went up the gradient.
The magnificent mansion, spreading over 130 acres with 340 rooms under its roof, beautifully laid gardens and ceremonial halls, is easily the most imposing sight of New Delhi. Seat of India's titular head, the historic Rashtrapati Bhavan has been a resident of 14 presidents since the birth of independent India.
So it was very interesting in those days. The architect actually drew sketches. So Lutyens and Baker drew sketches of how they, in their imagination, had envisaged the central area, that is the Viceroy's house and north and south block, coming down the gradient to what is now Vijay Chowk, and then Parliament House on the side. So let's look at that as the core area of the new capital. Lutyens walked around, wandered around, went around India, and was very influenced, for instance, by Sarnath for the dome of Rashtrapati Bhavan. If you look at the dome of Rashtrapati Bhavan, along its edge runs what runs along the pattern that runs along the Sanchi Stupa, for instance. So you don't feel when you walk into Rashtrapati Bhavan that you're in some alien building and it's like a museum. For instance, the pillars, those are clearly Western to look at, but he used the bell at the top of the pillar. It's called the Delhi Order. Every pillar in Rashtrapati Bhavan has 4 bells. Now the bell, the ghanti, is used in temples. There is a certain religious significance, there is a cultural significance to bells, and he brought that element in. The floors, beautiful motifs on the floors, all inlaid. So there was a great deal of interaction between the Indian ethos and the Western very strong building ethos.
On the 2 flanks of Rashtrapati Bhavan stands North Block and South Block, called Secretariat buildings of the imperial capital. Today, they house the key ministries of the Government of India.
While building the new Delhi, the new imperial capital, special emphasis was laid on not just the layout of the city, but design on the buildings and other motifs. Lutyens chose the amalgamation of Indian and Western style, something like the lotus flower that he used extensively on the pillars and other structures as well. Other motifs like jalis, chhajjas and chhatris were used too.
Apart from the chhajja, he used the motif of the lotus underneath the chhajja. So when you look up at it, you have a very nice inlay of the lotus motif. He then used courtyards. Now in India, as we know, Havelis have courtyards. People sleep out in the summer. They wet the floors of the courtyard. It cools down the building. He used a lot of those elements. He used a lot of ventilation, because you know that 8 months, 9 months of the year are really unbearable without wind passing through and cooling down the insides of homes. Stone was used, so stone can absorb the heat, and therefore you needed the counterpoint to it. He used calligraphers to draw and paint on the vaulted ceilings of the long corridors. So he used corridors, princely India, European concept of corridors and long ballrooms and all of that, but he embellished it with Indian motif. So there was a very interesting mix of India and the West, of the East and the West. It is believed that the king actually directed him to do that, to create a viceroy's house that is clearly India and not a building that could be anywhere else in the world. So it was a partnership of 2 cultures, a shared legacy, I call it.
In the outer lawns of North and South blocks still stands the symbol of then British imperial dominance, These four pillars, a tall statement of allegiance of then dominions of Australia, South Africa, New Zealand and Canada.
Interestingly, the idea was to actually face Rashtrapati Bhavan looking at Shahjahanabad. So if you see it today, it's facing Indraprastha, because beyond Rajpath is the sports stadium and there's Indraprastha, supposedly the first city of Delhi. Actually, the idea was to connect it to the previous city of Delhi. So they had wanted to face it that way. Harding, in fact, had listened to the comment by Lancaster to face it towards Shahjahanabad. But there was so much population along that road, you know, the Paharganj and the Ridge and so on, they couldn't compensate all those people if they had to remove them and put them somewhere else. The exchequer couldn't afford it, so they decided to face it to Indraprastha.
Well, coming down to Rajpath from Rashtrapati Bhavan to India Gate side, on the left flank stands the most powerful symbol of our democracy, the Parliament House, the great institution which has seen the evolution of modern India. The circular building, which also hailed as an architectural marvel, houses an interesting story behind its design.
There was an attempt by Baker to make it octagonal, and that battle Lutyens won, the circular, because he had conceived of Connaught Place based on the circular arcade in Bath in England, which is also, and so he wanted from one circle to move to another circle. And talking about circles, symbolically, his glasses were circle, they were round glasses he wore. If you go to Rashtrapati Bhavan in the gardens, there's a wall around the swimming pool which is with big circles. He used the circle motif on embellishments on inlay on the floor of some of the rooms in Rashtrapati Bhavan. Geometrics were very important in his balancing of design and design and motif. I keep repeating the word motif because it was very important in the architecture of all the buildings, in fact.
In the days of imperial capital, this circular wonder housed the Council of States, the Chamber of Princes, Legislative Assembly, and the Great Hall. Post-independence, the chambers were renamed as Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, and third one housed the Supreme Court of India for some time, while the Great Hall was simply renamed as the Central Hall. Together, these chambers have been witness to the making of a vibrant and diverse republic. It's here the representatives of the citizens and the state shape the future of the nation of over 1.2 billion. Another feature of New Delhi is design and layout of its roads and lanes, converging and meeting the historic Rajpath. Rajpath, the celebrated path of a grand and colourful Republic Day parade.
If you take Kingsway, which is now Rajpath, it crossed in the middle with Queensway, which is now Janpath. Lutyens wanted that to be the cultural hub. So you have the National Museum, you have the National Archives, and you have IGNCA. So you have the National Museum, National Library, you have a cultural space, and you have the National Archives. So he conceived of the rotaries because of the winds that come through northern India in the summer, the loo. His plantation and the rotaries were actually to stop like a buffer to these sweeping winds. They'd go round the rotary, the velocity would slow down. So they didn't sweep through the city, they were stopped. That was the concept, and it worked.
The history of New Delhi remains incomplete without the story of India Gate. The war memorial at the end of Rajpath is today among the most flocked sight. symbol of not just the city but the country. The India Gate forms the locus of the hexagonal section which marks the end of Rajpath. The grand monument with the names of soldiers who fought for the British inscribed over it houses the eternal flame of an immortal soldier, Amar Jawan Jyoti, the powerful symbol of countless courage, valor and sacrifice.
India Gate was built to commemorate those who died fighting with the British, for the British. Sadly, there's no commemoration of all the Indians who paid for and fought with the British for their victories anywhere in the world, and it is only here in New Delhi.
Behind India Gate stands a lonely canopy which once housed the statue of King George V. Around India Gate stands grand buildings which once served the residencies of former heads and regents of India's princely states. Post the abolition of principalities, these buildings were acquired by the Government of India. Today, from a city court, High Court, National Gallery of Modern Arts and other government offices function out of these buildings.
The idea was that along Rajpath to have the Maharajas of different states owning properties which would be their residence in the imperial capital. But independence came and that changed. So if you look at the far end where India Gate is, you have Prince's Park. And we are sitting in one of those buildings. Bikaner House belonged to the Maharaja of Bikaner and then was taken over by the Government of India. But these were built for those Maharajas as their personal residences. Patiala House, Jaipur House, around this entire circle.
Carefully crafted and well planned to allow sun and air, they stand as a symbol of a city which has lived through the ages.
The trees, very carefully thought through. Evergreen trees, fruiting trees, neem. Why neem? Because neem was an antiseptic that kept away the insects and creepy crawlies through the summer. The depth of the hedges of all the bungalows was a certain depth so that it buffered the sound of the street if you were sitting in your garden. You didn't need high walls for it. You know, it was open. There was no walls. The hedges became the walls that demarcated plots of residential areas in the city.
Today, these bungalows of Lutyens Delhi are home to India's powerful, from the Prime Minister, Cabinet Ministers, to the leaders of political parties.
I don't think New Delhi should be called Lutyens Delhi. We use that carelessly. Lutyens didn't call it Lutyens Delhi. The British didn't call it Lutyens Delhi. For the British, it was an imperial capital they were building for the jewel in their crown. For us, it was New Delhi. The rest of it is Shahjahanabad, which we call Old Delhi for some reason. It is Shahjahanabad. There is Indraprasth. There is various layers of the cities of Delhi. I think we should just call it New Delhi.
Delhi has lived and stood as a symbol of a composite, complex and a diverse country. From glory of power to decline and fall of empires. From list of business still to be accomplished to major achievements in making this democratic republic. The story of Delhi is a corpus of several narratives woven in one. Hope you like our series Talking History. Keep watching Rajya Sabha TV for more. Thank you.